Looks like a good group for Saturday morning. I noticed the 9 o'clock session was a little thin. It might have had something to do with the note I had that people were going to meet at the bar at 9:30 last night. But I'm sure you're all now awake and alert. This session is going to talk about national security impacts of climate change. And I'm Ed Richards. I'm a professor at LSU Law School. I teach both climate change law class and a national security class, also administrative law, which is the theme that runs through all of this, of course. I had worked in the science side of life before I went wrong and got into law, and so I've tended to stay working on scientific and technical problems. I've actually got a master's in public health and disease control along the way, and so I was working with pandemic agents, animal control, AIDS, before 9/11 rolls around, and with 9/11 we suddenly got interested in bioterrorism, and that was my segue into the more formal national security establishment. And I did some work with Homeland Security and Centers for Disease Control and Justice Department. I think after a while they didn't want to work with me anymore because I wasn't willing to buy into the larger problem that we like to talk about these problems, but we don't like to spend any money on them. So that'll be sort of one of our threads. Now, divide this into three areas. One of our debates in national security law is how much are environmental factors and environmental disasters national security versus local disasters. The first topic, destabilization of political regimes and demographic catastrophes, clearly national security. We'll talk about that in more detail. The second is extreme weather events. New Orleans with Katrina is an example, Hurricane Sandy. We can go to Bangladesh and find storms that kill 400,000 people, create significantly more disruption. One of the things that we should have learned from Hurricane Katrina that we didn't, and it was obvious in Sandy, is that for all of our talk about being prepared, there is no way to be prepared for a regional disaster. That gets into how we might respond. And then health impacts, including emerging infectious diseases. Everyone's got Zika on the brain at the moment, so that's a nice topic to lead to talk about there. So let's talk about the destabilization. Deployed people hanging around the cities, Arab Spring comes around. Normally a regime like Assad would be able to keep that under control, but we had this added large group of people, contributes to the political unrest. Now, you know the aftermath of that. We have classic national security issues about the Soviets in with Assad. We don't like Assad, but were we foolish to think that we could get rid of Assad? As is being talked about in the campaign trail right now by all people, Donald Trump. Maybe it was a mistake to try to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Maybe it would have been better with a stable world. The thought of Donald sort of mirroring my thoughts just makes me want to think maybe I was wrong. The Iraq War was a better idea than I remember. But aside from that, we recognize this as a classic political conflict. And it's pouring refugees into Europe, into Turkey, into Greece. Huge problems in Europe. Are these climate refugees? If they were just climate refugees, your typical starving farmer in Africa, they'd be economic refugees. And economic refugees have no international rights. We exclude them. Pretty much everybody excludes them. Once this transforms from a climate-driven economic refugee, starving farmer, to destabilize society, and that starving farmer is now fleeing political persecution, we trigger the was it 53, 52 Refugee Convention. These folks now have a full bundle of international law rights. So Syria is really giving us a look at the future of demographic issues from climate change, but a future that's shaped by the fact that first we transform them into political refugees and have a bundle of international rights. Now you can imagine what this kind of demographic warfare will look like if we've got, say, Bangladesh destabilized between the combination of sea level rise on their delta, catastrophic storms and drought, and they pour into China and India, two hostile nuclear-armed territories. So, as we'll talk, the second speaker will probably talk about, these are the sort of things that really worry the military. And these trigger humanitarian aid issues, military action, diplomatic actions. These are classic presidential powers, commander-in-chief, sole organ of foreign policy. And as our later speakers will talk about, will Congress follow along? Let's think about extreme weather events. This is a church in the 9th Ward. Some pictures that I took after the storm. This is the bridge looking from the Mississippi side, just to remind us of the power of the storms. So in this particular national security thread, first issue, of course, is sea level rise and tropical cyclones superimposed on that for the places that are subject to them. Our Atlantic and Gulf coasts, pretty much all of Asia, where we've got a lot of mega cities sitting on deltas. One of the things we know is that storms may or may not get worse, but they'll go farther north. So in any given northern location, like say New York City, they'll get worse storms if for no other reason than the same storms get farther north. We also know with sea level rise that every river delta will recede. The river deltas date from 6,000 years ago when sea level rise leveled off. Low-lying lands will flood. Miami, Bangladesh. Louisiana notions like coastal restoration are absurd if you believe in climate change. The delta cannot be restored, it will retreat. We need to be figuring out where we go with that in the longer term. We probably have 2 meters of sea level rise baked in right now, even if we have a kumbaya moment and suddenly solve climate change next week. I'm not betting on that. I mean, the China talk earlier wasn't terribly optimistic, but being in Louisiana, a lot of the issues sounded pretty familiar, so I'm not sure how well we're going to do either. That's not 2 meters by 2100. It's 2 meters by some time. Maybe 2050, maybe 2100, who knows if things really go wrong. The point is moving a coastal city, New Orleans, Miami, Richmond, Virginia, you could name a lot of cities. Unless you've got elevation, you're going to have to move. It'll only be a question of do we do a long-term logical depopulation, or will it be punctuated catastrophe where you flood a little, then you're catastrophically destroyed until there's not enough left. Now, I'm betting we'll do that because it's easier, and besides, hurricane and storm recovery is really a bipartisan jobs program. It's not really disaster relief. But rationally, we should be planning to do these relocations, and we should be starting 100 years early, like in 2005. So what are our legal issues? Federal government. Stop subsidizing bad decisions. National Flood Insurance Program, Road Home and other programs that rebuild in the same place, relocate critical infrastructure, rethink where we're going to be putting the Mississippi River cargo when the Mississippi is so hydraulically contracted that it's no longer going to be navigable. Legal issues for state and local government. In our own region, and this is not just us, it's interesting, every coastal area has its own mythology about how we can hold back the sea. King Canute would be proud. Got to move away from dangerous areas. We've got to incentivize relocation. Again, relocating critical infrastructure. Don't subsidize bad decisions with insurance regulation. Now, these are really tough legal political problems, which so far we have been unable to deal with anywhere in the United States. And I'm certain that every other country, China, Vietnam, Japan, every megacity sitting on a delta has these same issues. So when we get into the actual legal powers, how difficult are these? What is it going to take to change them? Now, talk about emerging infectious diseases, health effects. There's our Aedes aegypti we've been hearing so much about lately with Zika. I'm sure you can catch one of these in your own home around here, probably in the bathrooms here at the law school. They're all pervasive. They like to live with people. These are just a couple of slides that I stole from the WHO. The key point of this is we focus way too much on it's going to get warmer farther north, and Aedes aegypti doesn't really survive cold winters, so its range is going to expand. These are all cultural issues. They're a combination of climate-driven cultural change. So undernutrition is also a huge health problem that will come with climate change. Diarrheal diseases are linked to climate change issues, heat in some of these tropical countries. Malaria is already killing 90,000 a year. It's pretty exciting. Extreme weather events themselves are killing people, although not hurricanes and the like most of the time. Heat events are the big killers. And they kill statistical people, so we don't tend to notice them. But was it 2003, Paris heat wave killed 50,000 or so people in developed countries, just to remind us how much this can matter. This is just an interesting curve of diarrhea related to temperature. Diarrhea is not a sexy disease, but it kills a lot of children. Then we have the scary ones, the emerging infectious diseases. For those of you that are young, you don't think of HIV/AIDS as an emerging infectious disease. It's been around your whole life. For those of us that are old, who are involved in disease control when it came on the scene, still tend to think of it that way. We don't talk about it as a climate change disease, but in fact, it is a disease that emerged through changing cultural patterns in development in certain parts of Africa, where the virus that was living in the monkeys, through cultural patterns and other things, gets introduced more into people, and those people start traveling. That's the kind of disruption you get when climate changes the farming practices, changes the forest, changes cultural practices. West Nile, or more recent infectious emerging disease, St. Louis encephalitis. I think this was in the 80s. These are our mosquito-borne diseases. West Nile, dengue, Zika, chikungunya. These are all the same family. They're also the same family as yellow fever, just to keep you alarmed. They're flavoviruses, and they're mosquito transmitted. And we don't actually know nearly enough about them. Turns out we still don't know whether dengue, which is, we're worried about Zika because of microcephaly and maybe Guillain-Barré. Dengue and chikungunya really make you sick and can kill you right off the bat without having any intermediary problems. But we don't know things like, do they have an animal host? That matters a lot. Because if you've got a disease that the mosquitoes can reseed from rats or bats or monkeys, you're never going to eradicate it. These diseases have moved in to our parts of the world. Then we've got the pandemic flu bioterrorism issues out there. Climate not as related unless the bioterrorists get stirred up by demographic war. Then the all-purpose who knows what. So where does this fit in? Let's think about dengue for a minute. Dengue's not really about the mosquitoes having the range. We've got the mosquitoes. Every time I try to open my back door in Baton Rouge, I can see the little buggers trying to get in. Where dengue and the mosquitoes find their nexus is when you can't get away from the mosquitoes, and oddly, it's drought that tends to be the tip over, because Aedes aegypti lives in little puddles, old tires, storage tanks for water. Aedes aegypti becomes a problem in areas where there's a lot of these little places for water to collect, because aerial spraying doesn't hit those. You've got to be on the ground poking your nose into people's backyards. If we were really going to deal with Zika and other things, this is all local public health. Dealing with all of these emerging diseases is local public health. We have gutted local public health infrastructure over the last 20 years. The feds still have emergency plans that are built around huge amounts of local public health infrastructure that does not exist. We have bad leadership in this at the CDC and the Homeland Security. One of the reasons I don't work with them anymore, because they want to cover this up. I can remember being at training things where there'd be, and here our smallpox preparedness plan depends on the states. Think about Louisiana. Doing everything right for the first 10 days. And if they don't do everything right for the first 10 days, you're in the second cycle of the disease, and you are just hopelessly screwed. Yet our plans still are based on that. So we've had this, what I try to present is a group of issues where the legal authority ranges from the president's commander-in-chief, state and local government, to local government. And all of these pieces have to work if we're going to be properly prepared to deal with these threats. And on that note, I will actually blank this and turn it over to our next speaker.
Thanks, Ed. My name is Jonathan Walsh. For those of you looking forward to an incredibly erudite discussion from a naval commander in the U.S. Navy and the author of a recent Law Journal article that's going to be coming out from, I think, Cardozo, called The Commander-in-Chief's Authority to Combat Climate Change, I'm sorry that you're all going to be very, very disappointed. I am not Commander Mark Nevitt. I am Jonathan Walsh. I'm an adjunct lecturer here at Tulane in the Homeland Security Department. I teach counterterrorism. In fact, I was scheduled to be teaching counterterrorism this morning, and it is only the grace of my director and my students who've allowed me to come here and fill in for Commander Nevitt. I'm a 14-year, when I got out of the Coast Guard, I'd been in for 14 years, 1997 to 2011, where I did port security, anti-terrorism and force protection. I deployed to Kuwait. I deployed to Gulfport after Hurricane Katrina. I deployed to Houston after Hurricane Ike. So I've done a lot of the stuff, the scary things that the first speaker was just talking about. If you don't think that climate change is a national security issue, I want you to know that Lindsay Lohan has chikungunya virus. Okay? So if it can strike Lindsay Lohan, it's a threat. There is a lot of legal basis and legal authority for the military, for Department of Defense, and for the Coast Guard, who are Homeland Security, to get involved in climate change. And this is one of the hottest topics in national security as we sit here today. Everybody likes to talk about ISIS. Everybody likes to talk about Al-Qaeda. Last year, in 2014, I was privileged and fortunate enough to attend an address by the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who spoke at the University of Notre Dame right before the Michigan football game. Michigan still hasn't scored on us since then. But he identified a number of threats to national security, and the first couple are our standard bugaboos: Russia, China, and North Korea. But climate change is definitely a major threat. And it's one that the Geographic Combatant Commands, this is a fancy term for NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM and EURCOM and PACOM, all of these geographical areas across the globe that the Pentagon has targeted, or the Pentagon has divided the globe and set up these commands, each one of them has been tasked to identify the primary threats to their existence. what is going to happen in their area of responsibility, and climate change is right there. Ed talked about the threat to infrastructure. There is no more threatened infrastructure than the world's largest naval base, which is in Norfolk, Virginia, the Tidal River Basin. If you've ever had the privilege of going to Marine Corps Camp Lejeune, and if there are any Marines in the audience, I will speak slower if you need. That area of the world has most of our ability to reach out and touch other countries. That area of the world has most of our ability to keep our shores safe. That area of the world is going away as quickly as we are. We in Louisiana love to talk about climate change and coastal erosion and things like that, but it's happening just as badly there. One of the things that we look at when we talk about commander-in-chief authority or the executive authority to address climate change absent congressional action, and this is something that Professor Werhan will start talking about in the third part of the presentation, the executive has a tremendous amount of ability on paper to address climate change. And the primary way that we do that is, of course, with the commander-in-chief authority. Okay, the president is the sole general, admiral, whatever you want to call it. He or she is the person who gets to select and direct the units. The traditional balance that we have in our separation of powers, you have the dichotomy between the purse of Congress and the sword of the president. The president is the warfighter, Congress is the funder. And this is where we have the classic battles between what can the president do and what will Congress fund. And where is that bright little line where Congress's failure to fund impermissibly treads into the president's ability to wage war and keep the country safe. The president also has the foreign affairs power, right? The president is the sole organ of foreign affairs. So there is an ability for the president via executive agreements, okay? The end of the Korean War is won. Not W-O-N, but O-N-E. That was an executive agreement that did not have congressional Article 2, right, treaty authority, okay? It's been a long time. I'm a graduate of Tulane Law School. It's been a long time since I've walked these Hallow halls. I'm glad to see the carpet is completely unchanged. So, there are two arenas, right, that this fight against climate change is going to be fought. One is international, and one is domestic. I will suggest to you that the president's options in fighting climate change, and for any Marines in the audience, this is a PowerPoint, by the way. This is just as effective. My Coast Guard experience got me out of the PowerPoint game entirely. I use it now as I'm a partner at Deutsche Carrigan here in town. That's what I actually do for a living. I clearly don't do this for a living. And PowerPoints, there's a great slide if you ever go out and look for it. There's from the Afghanistan War, a very well-intentioned junior officer put together one slide to explain for, I think it was General McChrystal when he came in and took over, put together one slide to explain the current situation in Afghanistan. And he put it up on the board, and McChrystal, or whoever the general was, looked at it and said, you know what? When we can figure out that slide, we'll have won the war. So, with all due respect to PowerPointers, not a big fan. So, how do we get there under international law? UN Security Council resolutions. In order to do anything, in order to deploy forces abroad, and that's how this is going to get done, we have to have a basis both in domestic and in international law. And the primary way you're going to get an international law basis for the use of force abroad to fight climate change. Because this is not a battle that's going to get fought with bullets, at least not in the first stages of this. But there will be a Security Council resolution that will address a refugee crisis brought about by climate change. When Bangladesh disappears below the ocean, where are those people going to go? Those people are there because India and Pakistan and China don't want them. That's why Bangladesh, the country, exists as a country called Bangladesh today. That's why Pakistan and India are separate countries. They don't want to be there. Why China is so supremely interested in North Korea. They don't want those people. But what happens when the famine hits and the society, now we've been saying that about North Korea ever since I was sitting on that side of the podium back in 1998. Hasn't happened yet, but when it does, that's a climate-caused foreign crisis, and there will be a UN Security Council resolution. The War Powers Resolution, which was meant to correct the ills of the Vietnam War, to balance the president's war-fighting ability, at then unrestrained, well, by the Constitution, but, you know, when was the last time we declared war? 1942 against, like, Romania or something like that. So it doesn't happen that often. In fact, throughout our nation's history, in the entire history of the Republic, I think it's only happened 5 times. But we've deployed forces abroad. Men and women have gone to die dozens and dozens of times. So the War Powers Resolution is a way for Congress to balance that ability for the president. And long story short, it basically gives the executive kind of a 60-day window in which to fight a war, if that's what you want to do. But there's also been conflicts like Kosovo, if any of you are young enough or old enough to remember Kosovo, where there was no War Powers Resolution touching. So there are ways for the president to get involved overseas, but it's going to happen, and I should have put this over here, I apologize. It's going to happen on the back end of a UN Security Council resolution. You also have the authorization for the use of military force. This is the document, right, that Congress gave to President Bush on September 12th of 2001, saying, go forth and conquer the bastards who did this to us. This is the authorization for use of military force. This is the basis in domestic law for all of our actions subsequently. It's 2016, okay? So you can question whether Congress will give this executive or the next another authorization for the use of military force to go after ISIS, but we don't have one. Everything that we're doing today relies upon the authorization for the use of military force back from 2001. Domestically, and we talked about Norfolk, if any of you have ever had the privilege of going to Biloxi, to Keesler Air Force Base, Biloxi Bay in the Gulf of Mexico, just come in and out of that place. Gustav ended operations there. And that's critically important, okay? The ability to put a C-5 or a C-7, these giant Air Force planes full of stuff with which you can feed a city or evacuate a city. Once the runways go away, that's gone. And that's a critical component of our war-fighting ability, but it's also a critical component of how we keep Americans safe, which is what the president is charged with. But there are ways the president can act domestically without congressional authority, so to speak, or on his own. And the primary way that's going to get done is with another acronym, DSCA. Defense Support of Civil Authority. All right? If anybody was here in New Orleans at Hurricane Katrina time, you experienced defense support of civil authority. Ed talked about the states and their inability to get things done, right? Whenever you look at how does America respond to a natural disaster, like Sandy or Katrina or anything like that, the first thing that happens under the Stafford Act is we rely upon the states. This is why a proactive governor will declare an emergency as early as possible. You can see the storm coming. You know that it is going to overwhelm not just the city of New Orleans' abilities to handle this disaster, but the Parish of Orleans, the state of Louisiana, our cooperative agreements with Mississippi and Texas and Alabama and Arkansas are all going to be overwhelmed, and we know it right now. So John Bel Edwards picks up the phone and calls Barack Obama and says, help. And the Stafford Act says that you've got to certify that you are out of capacity and that the federal response is going to follow the ultimate government acronym, which is what? What does LIFO stand for? That's it. Last in, first out. But there's an enormous capacity that the DoD, Department of Defense, has to respond to these events. And under the Stafford Act, the state has to say what capacity they need. And the president can authorize this without congressional interference. How am I doing on time? Good. Like, how much time left? Perfect. 5 minutes left. That means I have like 8 minutes of stuff to say. So, the president can do this, but what about on a day-to-day basis? How are we doing these things right now? What are we looking at right now? How does the president fight climate change or respond to climate change right now? That's where it's a little bit limited, especially domestically, okay? I'm sure Youngstown will be mentioned, the steel seizure case, which I'd forgotten about until this week when I was told I was going to speak on this panel. But the president, or let's stop saying the president. When we talk about DoD, appropriations by Congress, there is some leeway, right? Congress has the power of the purse, and the way money is spent in the government is highly regulated. But there is some capacity for independent action. And that capacity for independent action comes at the local level under, well, as a subset of the Defense Supportive Civil Authority, there is a concept known as immediate response authority. This happens when an airplane is diverted from the international airport or Lakefront Airport to Naval Reserve Station out in Belle Chase. For some reason, pilot has a heart attack, engine problems, something like that, so they have to land at Belle Chase, and they miss the runway. The local commander can send DoD forces or DoD elements out into the community, as it were, to respond to that immediate emergency, as long as life is at stake, or to ease suffering. But it has to be quick, and permission has to be sought as soon as you can, and as soon as the local response, the state response, is able to take over, then they have to leave. So there is some capacity there. We can never run afoul of the Posse Comitatus Act, right? What is the Posse Comitatus Act? It's that little paragraph in the law that was promulgated by Congress in the 1870s as a way to get federal forces out of voting rights enforcement. It kept the country together after the Civil War. And after it was passed, it was never really used. Federal troops were used in domestic law enforcement all the time, up until the 1970s, when we said, you know what, there's really a law against this stuff and we shouldn't be doing it. But by then our country had become a much different place, and our military had been tasked to do a lot different type stuff. So how then do we look at climate change in that environment of no law enforcement domestically? You can't use Marines to direct traffic. You can't. Well, a local commander can look at his peer or her peer and say, you know what? That's getting lower and lower to the water line every single year. That water is coming higher and higher into my base every single year. I can do something about it as long as it doesn't get over $1 million. You have to, the way the federal construction regulations go, a local commander can spend up to $1 million. And DoD, the Department of Defense itself, Pentagon, can spend up to $2 million without any sort of congressional bother. over that domestically, now you run into the problem of congressional oversight, and will Congress approve that? Because if that money is being spent to combat climate change, I would suggest that in the current political environment, Congress is not going to allow that. And it's a question of how is the executive going to essentially define or identify that project. But over $2 million, that project has to be specifically set up and authorized by Congress. So there are some ways for the president to do this. Looking forward, we talked about the threat of Zika virus and how excited must the U.S. women's national team last night, qualifying for the Olympics, going right on into Zika virus hell, right? But all of these things, what we haven't talked about yet is the Arctic, okay? And that is, I think, where we should be looking, where we're going to have the most immediate effects on the national security level as it pertains to climate change, because all of a sudden, where there used to be ice and there used to not be questions about international boundaries and exclusive economic zones, thanks to global warming, or whatever you want to call it, ice melt, now we have a coastline of Greenland and Canada and Norway and the United States that is open to maritime commerce, trade, fishing, petrochemical, all that stuff, and we are feeling our way, okay? The Navy is involved in this. The Coast Guard is taking a very aggressive stance on this, or is very forward-leaning, I should say. But really, all of DOD has been very forward-leaning as far as climate change goes. All of the geographic combatant commands are developing plans to deal with it, whether it's refugees or drought, famines, or conflicts that are brought about over resource allocation and sharing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Werhan.
Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Keith Werhan. I teach here at Tulane in the constitutional law area and the administrative law area. So on behalf of Tulane, I'd like to be presumptuous enough to thank Ed and Jonathan for their thoughtful presentations, although I have to say personally, both of them make me want to crawl under a rock and kind of not get up for quite a while after a good sleep. Because the issues they raise are so daunting. I want to especially thank Jonathan. You know, Mark Nevitt, as he said, was supposed to be part of our panel. He's on active duty service at the Pentagon and literally was told just a couple of days ago that he had a plane ticket to the Middle East, basically next flight out to handle some kind of undescribed emergency, and so he wasn't able to join us. And Jonathan graciously and impressively, really on just a day or two's notice, really, was able to really kind of give us a very thoughtful presentation. So Jonathan, as a former student of mine, thank you. It's very good to see you strutting your stuff up here. So what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about what I know about, which is really not climate change and not national security, but about separation of powers and maybe the administrative law nexus. So what strikes me about this problem, the national security dimensions of climate change, it just seems to me this powerful and poignant question about the capacity of a document that was kind of state of the art in the latter stages of the 18th century, whether or not it's really up to the task of allowing us to respond to just literally, just undoubtedly, a problem that challenges the survival of the world. This has been a recurring issue in constitutional law. Whenever we reach a stage of crisis in one form or another, it does drive us back to first principles, and it does raise the question of whether or not the framework that we've inherited from our founders can serve us well and serve us in dealing with a problem that they literally could not have envisioned and did not envision. That's what I would like to basically lay the framework for exploring in our conversation after I conclude, to just kind of get a sense of both the, I don't know, the logic of the separation of powers system, how it plays out domestically, and with respect to external affairs, as Jonathan was touching on, kind of explore the differences between those two terrains, which are real, but then to fuzz them up, which I tend to like to do, because I think actually the distinctions are many times really kind of overdrawn, although there is a kernel of truth there. So let's start with the basics. I like to start at the ground level and then walk up. So separation of powers is embedded in our Constitution in the first three articles. The basic doctrine of separation of powers really contains two elements. One's descriptive, the other is normative. One's saying what is, the other is saying what should be. The what is, and this is kind of controversial, and this will, it has implications here, but according to the theory, when the government acts, at least when it affects individual rights, the idea is that there are only three kinds of powers that any government has, and so any governmental action that affects rights, by definition, will fall under one and only one of those powers. And that's, of course, the legislative power, the power to make law, the executive power, not the power to kill law, but the power to carry it out, to administer law. And third, the judicial power, the power to resolve disputes that arise under the making or application of law. So the descriptive principle is that anything the government does that's worth caring about, those that affect rights, will fall into one and only one of those three categories. The normative part is, in order to have good government, it's necessary to separate the powers so that each power is going to be held by a distinct and distinctive power holder. So we do that in Article 1 when we vest the legislative power of the United States in Congress, in Article 2 vesting the executive power in the President, and the judicial power in the Supreme Court and whatever lower courts Congress may decide to create. By good government, the framers meant two things, and we tend to lose sight of this. What everybody emphasizes, and what is undoubtedly true, is that this division of power is good because it diffuses power, so that we can avoid a tyranny. So the framers view a tyranny as where all of governmental powers is in one hand. By diffusing power, by diffusing the three powers of government, we are disabling tyranny, because each power holder only has 1/3 of the governmental power. Each power holder is going to be dependent in some sense on the cooperation and coordination of the other power holders before they do what we care about, which is to affect our rights. So one of the good things the framers thought about separation of powers is that it is a structural, embedded protection of individual liberty, of individual rights, defining rights from their perspective in a negative way as the absence of governmental interference with our autonomy, not in a positive way of actually creating things for us that would help us live a better life, education, health insurance, and the like. So diffusing the power is conducive of individual liberty because again, each of the power holders has a limited role, a limited authority to touch our lives. But the other part of separation of powers that they firmly believe is that separating powers was conducive to effective government. That by separating powers, we would get a kind of division of labor, so that so that the framers could devise, in their view, not only a legislative branch, but for them the optimal legislative branch, the very best holder of the legislative power. Sometimes in our experience, we can kind of question that judgment, but their thought process was actually fairly solid in the sense that Article 1 creates the most democratic branch of the government, Congress, right? Divided into two houses, which will require some deliberation and thought and cooperation before laws are actually made, before the legal status quo is changed in a formal way. So it's a very important principle, at least as a default matter, that Congress goes first. Congress is Article 1. Congress begins the process by formulating a law. The president's job is to carry out the law. So the president comes in second. And the president, by and large, we're going to talk about exceptions, by and large is not an initiator. By and large, the president is sitting, his power life goes on only when Congress gives him or her authority to act. The president, in the eyes of the founders, was the optimal holder of the executive power because it is one person. And so no one would be able to pass the buck. There would be a kind of a unified responsibility for taking care that laws are faithfully administered. No one, we're not going to be in the position of saying, as we often are in our in our day-to-day lives, weren't you supposed to do that? I thought you were supposed to do that. No, the president is supposed to do that. He's not engaging in the day-to-day execution of laws, but he has a supervisory responsibility of taking care that the laws are faithfully executed. He can't punt that to anyone else. And finally, of course, the court is in the view of the framers, our optimal adjudicator. They are as divorced from politics as we can make them. They are freed up institutionally to make decisions according to law and according to conscience and their sense of the deep values of our country, rather than responding to the demands of the moment. So domestically, the way this plays out is that the process, as a strong default matter, begins with an act of Congress, which then authorizes the president to take action affecting individual rights, subject to judicial review for the lawfulness of the presidential execution and the congressional enactment. So if you notice, the separation of powers doctrine, this on the domestic side, really describes a constitutional process of decision-making, whereby our individual rights will legitimately be shifted. It sets up a default rule that before our rights can change, Congress has to have written a law that the president is administering and that the court has done a legal audit on and signed off on its legality and legitimacy under our commitment to rule of law. The separation of powers gives a role for each institution. Before individual rights are finally adjusted. Congress has to have authorized it, the president has to have kind of done it, and the court has to have signed off. So each institution has a role before any of our rights shifts. And under separation of powers, each institution is confined to its role. Right? So Congress, when we say Congress has the legislative power, in this beautiful Zen-like way that the constitutional framers absorbed when we say that Congress has a legislative power. We're saying that's the only power you have. You don't have executive, you don't have judicial power. President has executive power, but you don't have legislative power. You don't have executive power. So each of the institutions are able to affect rights only within their role, only within their stage of decision-making, right? So when Congress asserted the prerogative of asserting a legislative veto over presidential and executive decisions, the court struck that down because basically what Congress had required is that the system, instead of flowing for judicial review, would back up to the court. And Congress's power is to make law, not to execute the law. When, as Jonathan suggested, when the president decided during the Korean War to seize the nation's steel mills to head off a strike, that the president was concerned would compromise our war effort. His move to invalidate, or his move to seize under an executive order, under his own initiative, was struck down precisely because it was under his own initiative. It was not authorized by Congress, and indeed it flew in the face of congressional sentiment, the court held. If the court tries to decide a legal question without having a proper case before it, we say that that's an advisory opinion, that they don't have power to act unless a case has come to them. So at least on the domestic side, we have a process that creates the Congress as initiator, the president as the authority that translate abstract laws into here and now legal impacts by enforcing law against individuals with a right to judicial review in the courts. So that's the domestic picture. The picture in foreign affairs is different than that. The president, I think everyone would say, is not only playing the secondary role, pivotal, but secondary role, but has more power of initiative in the foreign sphere, has more power to act first without explicit congressional authorization. And I think that is right, although I think it's going to be a little limited, as I'm about to say. So the president does have authority, but it's not correct to say that the president has the foreign affairs power. That's something that you'll see in some cases, and it's something that you'll see in an awful lot. I used to work at the Justice Department. You'll see in an awful lot of Justice Department opinions and other opinions by federal agencies, but it's simply not accurate. There is no foreign affairs power in the Constitution, and that was a considered choice by the framers. 5 minutes. At the time of the framing, in the English practice, according to Blackstone, the king, the crown, had a foreign affairs power. That included the power to make war. That included the power to make the peace after war, power to make treaties, power of diplomacy, and there is a and the power of military command and support, right? War, military command, support, treaties, diplomacy. So the crown had all of that. The framers did not give all that power to the president, nor did they give it to Congress. Their strategy was to disaggregate the foreign affairs power. Let's not talk about foreign affairs power. Let's talk about the power to make war. Let's talk about the power of military command. Let's talk about the power to support the troops. Let's talk about the power to make treaties. And with respect to each of those areas, they divided the power strategically between President and Congress. So Congress has the power to make law, or rather to declare war. But the President has the power of military command. But Congress has the power to raise and support the armies, to make rules and regulations for the armed services. So the President has a power of military command, but Congress has the overall authority to kind of make the policy commitments of now we're going to have a war, now we're going to have peace and the like, at least as a general matter. With respect to treaties, the President has the power to make treaties, to negotiate them, but they don't become effective unless the Senate approves them by a 2/3 vote. The President has a diplomatic power, has the power to recognize foreign governments, has the power to name ambassadors, but the ambassadors are subject to Senate confirmation. So the powers are divided, and the powers are divided not according to the domestic principle of lawmaker versus law executor, but according to the institutional characteristics of Congress and the President. If you think about this power allocation, Congress is getting the power that we want the most democratic institution to have. They're getting the power that we want not one person, the decisions to make, not one person to make, but the decisions we want a group of representatives to make. So Congress has the power to declare war. We're not going to give that to a president. We're not going to give that to one person. Congress has the power to confirm treaties, to make them legal obligations, the supreme law of the land. We're not going to give that to the President. The President just doesn't have that authority. Congress has the authority to review and confirm our representatives in foreign governments. The President has the authority that is appropriate for one person, the power of military command. We don't want Congress. You need one person doing that. The flexibility, nimbleness to negotiate a treaty, you don't want 535 people doing that. You want a single-headed group doing that. So the distribution is between the one and the many. Briefly, the President does have power to make executive agreements, but the important thing about executive agreements, and this is all contested, so I'll give you my take on it. The important thing about executive agreements, as opposed to treaties, is that treaties impose legal obligations. Treaties have the force and effect of law as legally binding statements. That's why they require Senate approval. Executive agreements don't. Executive agreements are agreements. They may be binding, but they don't affect individual rights in the same way. That's why the President can do it. The only exception to that, the Supreme Court has held, is where the President acts pursuant to an Article II power. So the President does have the power to recognize foreign governments and has had power in connection with that authority to make legally to make agreements that have legal effects. Otherwise, for an executive agreement to have legal effects, the court has actually found that they are authorized by Congress. So that's one point. Just really in wrapping up, the way in which these kind of come together is that in both instances, before we really take holistic action, we require consensus among distinct power holders on both sides. Many of the President's actions to act on his or her own initiative, DOD, all the things Jonathan was mentioning, I think, and you can correct me, but I think in a sense they are individual decisions by the executive of how to respond to a particular episode, but they're all supported by general authorities given to Congress. So the President's not acting on his own. The President has a general authority that Congress has given precisely because they realize we need one person to respond to an emergency. So Congress makes the policy call, and it gives this authority to move out. The President although the president, the executive, is making, in an important sense, his or her own initiative in addressing a particular problem, they're not doing it on their own authority. Congress has signed off on the president using the initiative. And the same is less true in the foreign sphere, where the president has more authority on his or her own to kind of go out. But before the president makes any kind of binding commitment, right? So the president has authority to respond to sudden emergencies militarily, but really has to find legal authority before committing us to anything like a war. So it's true we've had relatively few declared wars, none since '42, but in the conflicts that rose to the level of war, the president didn't act on his own. The president acted either on the basis of congressional authority, the Iraq War, or the president, Afghanistan, Iraq War, or pursuant to UN Convention, the Korean War. So the distinctions are real and subtle, but I would want to argue the essential principles are the same. The president on his own, her own, has very limited authority in any sphere to take actions that involve policy commitments that are going to affect the legal rights of us. But that said, Congress has given the president wide authority. UN conventions, treaties give the president wide authority to act pursuant to those authorizations. And so, maybe I know I've gone past my time. So we'll just allow the discussion to flesh this out to the extent you would like. Thanks.